Tracy Kilkenny entered the restaurant at 7 sharp, at the appointed time of her reservation. Heading to the front desk, she glanced around the tables to make sure her guest was already seated. As she approached the table with the maitre d', she was able to get a close-up look at her guest for the first time in 8 years. She had seen him in passing from a distance many times over the past few years, but as she got closer, she noticed the change that had taken place with her ex-husband. Always acting like a gentleman, Al Wentworth stood up as Tracy approached the table. She started to lean toward him for a kiss before Al tensed and took a step back. A surprised expression appeared on Tracy's face, but she took the hint and sat down as the waiter had already held her chair for her. Looking into Al's gray-blue eyes, Tracy thought that time had been very kind to her ex. At 50+, the same age as his ex, Al had a thick mop of shoulder-length curly brown-gray hair. His face was almost wrinkle-free. He gave his ex-wife his trademark crooked grin, reached across the table with his right hand, and squeezed her left palm. He noticed that she was wearing the wedding rings he had given her in another life. Al also noticed the subtle changes over the years in his ex-wife. She had cut her long blonde hair into a short, chic style, and her face had a few laughing wrinkles. She looked about 15 pounds heavier than she had when the divorce papers were finally signed 8 years ago. But overall, in his opinion, she was still as beautiful as when he had first met her over 30 years ago. After a little small talk until their orders were taken, Al asked the million-dollar question. "What happened, Tracy? Why, after all these years, did you want to see me?" Tracy took a few deep breaths before answering. "Because I want you back in my life, at least as a friend, if that's okay with you," she replied. "In addition to everything else between us, we were very good friends once upon a time, a long time ago, and I miss that time. How about we try again without any preconditions?" "I can't promise anything, Tracy, but I think I'd like to give it a try. I think it would be nice to sit in a restaurant with a nice friend every now and then," Al said. The couple had a lovely evening and repeated it 2 weeks later. They continued to meet for dinner every 2 weeks. Al had to admit to himself that he enjoyed the evenings with Tracy. He had hardly dated anyone since his divorce and found himself enjoying both her company and her beauty. Al had graduated from college 6 months earlier with a degree in accounting when he and a few of his new co-workers were at a bar celebrating the end of the work week. Since he had never been to this particular bar before, he was looking around at both the people and the setting when his gaze stopped on the face of Tracy Valentine, one of several freshman medical students also celebrating the end of the week. It may not have been love at first sight, but at least it was lust at first sight. Al walked, actually staggered slightly, over to Tracy's table and introduced himself. When they parted later that evening, Tracy kissed Al gently on the lips and entered the correct numbers into his cell phone. A little over a year later, the young accountant and the medical student were married. Finances were a little tight because Tracy was still in medical school, but Al was making decent money and was a master budgeter. A couple gifts from their parents also helped the couple along the way. Tracy decided to go into medical research, and 6 years later she had 2 years of a successful research career. When the couple married, they decided it was time to have children. But one night, after a lot of boisterous lovemaking, Tracy quietly confessed to Al that she wasn't ready to be a mother yet. Al was disappointed, but what kind of thing would you say to the woman of your dreams? He agreed to a later date. For several years after that, Tracy was part of a 4-person team working on dementia-related illnesses. She loved the team aspect of her work, although, like many researchers, she noted that it was more emotional than most people assumed, and every little triumph or failure seemed much more significant. She would often come home and spend hours telling Al about the day's events and what the team was doing. Al would sit at the kitchen table, grinning from ear to ear as his wife told him just about every little thing that had happened during the day. For the previous 6 months, much of Tracy's evening chatter had focused on Dr. Steve Kilkenny, a member of her team who was going through a seemingly nasty divorce after his wife had cheated on him for 12 years. Like the other members of her team, Tracy had grown close to Kilkenny, and Al liked the guy on the occasions they were out. A few years older than him and Tracy, Kilkenny was a handsome, personable man, and Tracy in particular seemed very upset that his marriage was falling apart. Al was actually relieved when Tracy stopped gushing about Kilkenny and his marital troubles, but he became a little worried when she didn't mention anything about him at all for about 2 weeks straight. However, it was March, the busiest time for any accounting firm, so Al quickly put his domestic worries behind him as the 10 to 12-hour workdays began to pile up. The one thing Al noticed, however, was that Tracy's recent workdays had gotten harder as well. Once or twice a week she was working late, as was her husband. She attributed this to the fact that her team had reached several critical milestones in their research. Like most people, Al and Tracy didn't have a perfect marriage, but Al would bet money that they had a very good, maybe even great marriage. Constant communication was the key to it, Al thought, and that's why he was so surprised when Tracy started to become rude in her behavior toward him. "What's the matter, baby? Did I do something wrong? Please talk to me, honey," Al said one evening after another minor altercation. A couple weeks later, Tracy informed Al that her entire team would be traveling to Sweden in 2 weeks for a conference. Al said nothing, since such trips happened every other year. He thought that perhaps a break of a few days would be just what the doctor ordered for this couple. 2 nights before she was due to fly out, Tracy seemed to soften her attitude toward her husband somewhat. For the first time in 2 weeks, Tracy and Al found themselves in bed doing much more than sleeping together. After some very arousing sex until the very early hours of the morning, Al dragged his sleep-deprived ass into the office. "Get this man a big cup of coffee," said Larry Barnwell, another accountant in the office. "Make it big enough for me to jump in it," Al retorted. Despite the fact that Al could practically barely stay on his feet, he purred a cheerful tune under his nose all afternoon. "My Tracy is back," Al thought. 2 days later, Al dropped Tracy off at the airport and then headed to his office. As April 15th approached, it was another long day at work. As he prepared to leave the office just before 9 o'clock in the evening, he realized that Tracy never called him to let him know she had arrived at the hotel. Since it was 3 in the morning in Sweden, Al realized it was too late for him to call, but he set the alarm on his phone for 7 a.m. Swedish time so he could call her knowing that her conference was starting at 9. Al was sleepy when his alarm clock rang at 1 o'clock East Coast morning, 7 o'clock Swedish time, but he excitedly dialed Tracy's number on his phone. When the message went straight to voicemail, Al realized that Tracy had forgotten to turn her phone back on when she got off the plane. Since he wasn't planning on calling the hotel directly, he had to go online to find the right phone number. After making sure that the person answering the phone at the hotel front desk spoke English, Al asked to be connected to Tracy Wentworth's number. There was silence on the line for about 2 minutes before the person who answered spoke again and said that they didn't have Tracy Wentworth registered. "Wait, what about Steve Kilkenny, Jing Leong, or Russell Curtis? Are any of them registered?" Al practically shouted into the tube. We have Dr. Jing Leong, Dr. Russell Curtis, and Dr. and Mrs. Steve Kilkenny registered," the voice replied. "Dr. and Mrs. Al said quietly out loud. "Thank you for the information." He hung up the phone. Al no longer felt dizzy, but now he felt nauseous. He thought about going to his liquor cabinet, but instead reached into the medicine cabinet for a pack of Alka-Seltzer. Even though the workday hadn't officially started yet, it was already ruined, Al thought to himself. He left for his office early to get a fresh start to the day. At 10, he took a coffee break and called a friend who was a family lawyer. "Are you sure you don't want to wait until Tracy gets home before you start the paperwork?" Robert Levinson asked. "I mean, you don't have any hard evidence and you haven't even talked to your wife yet." "It's a no-fault divorce." "What does the evidence matter?" Al asked. "She's spending a week in Sweden, registered as his wife after giving me various subtle hints for the last 6 months. I wasn't born yesterday and I don't need to see any pictures or videos. We're pretty well settled in life ourselves and we don't have kids. Just split everything in half. She can buy my half of the house if she wants. This house isn't for me anymore." "You seem pretty aloof already," Robert commented. "But you know that sooner or later the feelings will catch up with you." "Actually, I'm devastated, Rob, but I've already had plenty of time to think things through. In fact, I was thinking of jumping on the next plane to Sweden and beating them both to death. But I'm not the mighty Ranger, or whatever the hell they call those guys who are super spies and can kill people with a simple paperclip. I guess I just want to know why. If she ever loved me at all, she owes me an explanation. Hell, if she ever loved me at all, why didn't she have the decency to tell me it was over and ask for a divorce? Tracy was the one who had booked the hotel for the conference in Sweden. She saw no reason to rent a room separately for herself, since Jing, Russell, and project manager Amy Carter knew about the affair she was having with Steve. Jing, in particular, told her that she was jealous because Steve was such a handsome and personable guy. I tried to be respectful and wait until his divorce was final before I made my move, but you didn't wait, you little varmint, Jing told her when she realized they had become a couple. Well, we started lunch when he needed a vest to cry into, and oh, miracle, I must have had a good vest. He was in pain, but he was so easy to talk to. I really started to care for him, and he and I have a lot in common. He's a great guy and a wonderful lover. Once they started having sex, Tracy and Steve got together 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes for long lunches and sometimes after work. They began exchanging kisses and touching occasionally during the workday, as Russell and Amy eventually found out. And they didn't seem to have a problem, as the lovers didn't show their relationship to the rest of the staff. The affair started innocently enough, as Steve needed a vest to cry into when he discovered that his wife of 12 years was cheating on him with another woman. The 4 team members were already close, and their frank discussions only brought the couple even closer together. When Steve realized that he was beginning to win Tracy's heart, he began to subtly draw comparisons between his marriage and Tracy's, and the desired effect was that Tracy, without realizing it herself, began to gradually lose respect for her husband. Tracy and Steve thoroughly enjoyed their week together, so much so that Steve was able to talk Tracy into joining the Mile High Club, airplane sex during the flight, on the overnight flight back to the United States. Knowing that her husband was going to pick her up at the airport, Tracy initially rejected Steve's amorous flirtations, but eventually gave in. The two ended their intimate rendezvous about an hour before the plane landed, and Tracy excused herself to go to the bathroom. Jing smirked at Tracy as she sat back in her seat. Tracy blushed slightly. Al opened the trunk as Tracy was leaving the terminal. He walked over to her, picked up her wheeled suitcase, and put it in the car. He made no attempt to kiss his wife, and she made no attempt to kiss or hug him, even though they had been separated for a week. Al wasn't sure, but when he took the luggage from his wife, he thought she smelled like recent sex. He thought he noticed that odor several times on the way home as well. Al wrestled hard internally with the urge to say something unpleasant before he finally muttered, "Did the conference go well?" Tracy spent the rest of the drive home regaling Al with stories from the conference. Al pretended to listen, sighing occasionally. If Tracy was really paying attention to her husband, she would have seen his knuckles turn white as he gripped the steering wheel tightly. When they reached their house, Tracy began to worry that Al might want some welcome-home sex. Then she realized that except for that moment before they left, she and Al hadn't had any sex in months. Worse, she noted to herself, her husband didn't seem particularly bothered by it. Al didn't stick around the house long after dropping his wife off. "I still have half a day for work I can do," he muttered as he headed for the door. Saturday morning, Al got up early and made a breakfast of bacon, eggs, and coffee. When Tracy finally showed up in the kitchen, the table was set and Al was sitting drinking coffee. He pointed to her seat, and Tracy sat down. She began to eat slowly before Al broke the silence. "So it was so much fun being Mrs. Steve Kilkenny for a week that you didn't even call once?" Al asked quietly. "Is it going to be permanent now?" Tracy began choking on her food while Al watched her impassively. Her thoughts quickly went back to last week. She was sure she had called Al when she landed. No, wait, she had forgotten to turn her phone on for over 24 hours. But there were no messages from Al even later. Could he have actually tried to call her in Sweden? Oh, God, no, she thought. It was about 2 minutes before Tracy realized she was looking at the table. She knew there were no right answers to Al's questions. "How long has this been going on, Tracy? Do you love him?" Al asked in an interrupted voice. "For over a year now," she practically whispered. She finally raised her eyes to Al. She wasn't sure if she should have answered the second question. "You love him, damn it!" I don't know," Tracy mumbled, stammering. "It's complicated. I could have a little, but that doesn't mean I don't love you." Al ran his hands through his hair and struggled to contain his hysterics. "What have I done wrong? All I know is that for the last 6 months, as far as I can tell, we've been going downhill, and now you're telling me you've been cheating on me behind my back for over a year, and you're spending a week in Sweden in the arms of this asshole, registered as Mrs. Stephen Kilkenny. Shit!" Tracy jumped when Al slammed his palm on the table. Al could see the thoughts swirling around in Tracy's head as she contemplated what to say to her husband. Hell, she was arguing with herself, not realizing what was even true about her relationship. Thinking back to the beginning, Tracy realized that she had probably gotten too close to Steve while he was having marital problems, and had started projecting the pain she was feeling with Steve onto Al. Then, when she and Steve actually started having sex, she found it fun, exciting, new. She was already emotionally close to Steve because he was a teammate, and those feelings grew stronger as the affair continued. She still loved her husband, while she loved Steve too, at least in part. The week she spent pretending to be Steve's wife in Sweden may have been the deciding factor that put Steve ahead of Al in what turned out to be an unspoken competition for Tracy's affection. "You didn't do anything wrong, Al. I still love you, but I also love him too," Tracy said quietly. "Ah," muttered Al inarticulately and continued, "There is no him or me in my world now, Tracy. I gave you every ounce of my love for over 20 years. I forgave you for breaking your promise to me to have children. I never sought love or comfort outside of our marriage, even though I had those chances. And this is how you reward my love and my trust? I haven't had over a year to think about it like you have, but your overnight stay in Sweden has given me a whole week to think hard and plan. The divorce papers will be served on you early next week. There's no fault in this state, Tracy. We'll split everything in half. You can buy my half of the house. I don't want anything to do with this house." "Wait, I'm not sure I want a divorce. Don't I have a say in the matter?" she asked. "No, you've lost that right. You made a choice in favor of this asshole. I'm making the decision to get a divorce." It didn't escape Al that not only had Tracy not apologized for hurting him, she hadn't apologized for her affair. Tracy was served at work the following Monday. She came home furious. "At work, Al, in front of my boss and team?" she said in disgust, throwing papers at Al as she entered their house. "Come on, say something else, Tracy. They all knew about your affair. None of them cared how I felt. Well, now I don't give a shit about how you feel." Tracy blushed thickly but didn't say another word. She hadn't made dinner either. He ordered a pizza for himself. Al had no idea what she ate. Al moved into a rented apartment 3 days later. Tracy bought out Al's share of the house when she signed the divorce. Steve moved in with Tracy a week later, although the divorce wasn't official for another 53 days. The two married 3 months after the divorce became final. 2 years later, Tracy and Steve divorced peacefully. Living with Steve every day for 2 years in accordance with the marriage vows and domestic problems had apparently dampened the excitement of sex somewhat, and it was becoming increasingly obvious to Tracy that she and Steve had never bonded emotionally the way she and Al had. For his part, Al dated women from time to time, but no longer found the connection with anyone that he had with Tracy before things fell apart. He hadn't followed up with his ex-wife since her marriage to Steve. "So what happened to Steve?" Al asked one night at dinner with Tracy. "Why are you wearing the rings I gave you again?" Tracy knew the questions would follow, but blushed anyway when asked about it. "I really thought I loved Steve. Maybe not quite as much as I loved you, but at the time I believed it was enough. All things considered, I found out I was wrong. And I came to the realization that I had given up on the man I truly loved and wanted to spend the rest of my life with. I wear rings to remind me of what I gave up." Later that night, Al brought Tracy to the apartment he had been living in since moving out of his house. The couple made slow, passionate love and then pressed against each other as they had once done long ago. Tracy remembered the good times when they would cuddle after sex. She had no way of knowing that all Al could remember were the bad times. It was morning when they both woke up. Since it was Saturday, neither of them had to be at work. Al made them both breakfast. When they were done, Al lifted Tracy out of her chair and led her to the door. She looked up at him with tears in her eyes as he opened the door and kissed her chastely on the cheek. He quietly placed his wedding ring in her hand as she walked out the door.